Welcome to part 6 of Theories of Personality. In this part, we're going to talk about the trait theories, which is an approach to studying the individual and distinguishing one individual from another. Our picture up here from The Wizard of Oz is kind of in line with that, is that, it was, such a great movie, a classic. And one of the things that made it was the distinct personalities of each individual and how they were different, but yet how they came together to, work together, and that chemistry that each and every individual brought made it such a successful interplay of personalities. When we talk about personality trait theory attempts to describe personality rather than to explain it. The personality theories that have come before this, the humanistic theories and the psychoanalytic and the neo-Freudian, what they have tried to do is try to explain how personality evolves and how we develop healthy or bad personalities. In the case here of trait theory, what we're going to attempt to do is describe personality. What is it that makes a personality healthy? What is it makes a personality unhealthy? But what are those particular traits? And to be able to look at an individual and say, okay, these are the traits that they have, and does this represent a healthy personality or an unhealthy personality? The characteristics of traits then are that traits are enduring patterns of behavior, being relatively stable over time. So personality traits, as they emerge, and they emerge generally in our early childhood, we start to see those. And I think one of the mysteries or being a parent is watching the personalities of your young children develop, and you start to see them take on the various characteristics. It's just wondrous. But what you're starting to see then is the beginning of patterns of behavior that are relatively enduring. How many parents sit around and watch the little kids start to develop and say, oh boy, this one's going to be a pistol, we're going to have to keep an eye on them, or boy, we're just going to enjoy life with this one so well. They've got a beautiful personality. But the thing is, we start to see them emerge, and for the most part, most of us ascribe the fact that they are going to be relatively enduring. If there is some negative traits, then we say, well, we need to work with them, watch it, and try to shape it or change it, which shows that why we use that term relative over time is that personality traits can change. Otherwise, what's the good of having psychotherapy? And, we as psychologists, as far as practitioners, might as well hang it up, because if people can't change and can't alter their personalities, no use or purpose for psychotherapy. The other fact is that traits differ across individuals, and that's what makes the world, I guess, so interesting. If we were all carbon copies of each other, it'd be pretty bland and boring. But what we like is that individuality and that uniqueness of each individual. And the other fact that, should be a given is that traits do have the ability to influence us. What are that unique set of characteristics that we have that we can use to describe ourselves does, in fact, define us and influence our behavior. Okay. From a biological perspective, when we talk about this, is that, we know that, that we inherit the genetics from our parents, and probably there's a good part of our personality that, in fact, is genetically inherited. I mean, how many times have we all personally experienced at various times in our life us responding to a situation going, oh my God, I sound just like my dad, or I sound just like my brother, well, or my mom or my sister. Well, there's good reason for that, in the sense that we share a common, genetic code. Not the same, but we share certain genes in common. And, if my mom's got a fiery personality, I'm going to get some of those genes, and I may have that. If my dad's calm, I may get those. And so, in between my brothers and sisters, we may, certain genes that we share in common, we may show similarly or different. But the thing is that there is an inherited. Following along on this, then, brain imaging procedures show that extroverts seek stimulation because their normal brain arousal is relatively low. So, when you talk about an extrovert wanting to get out and be stimulated and getting into, more dynamic situations, maybe taking some risks, being more adventuresome, it's because their normal brain level runs relatively low, and that, by doing these other things, it produces a stimulation. And that genes, as we've talked about here, can influence as well. Okay, when we look at this then, each individual then possesses a unique constellation of durable dispositions or consistent ways of behaving that constitute his or her personality. And here are just an example of some trait terms or characteristics that we can use. Some of these you might refer to as skills or aptitudes, abilities, dispositions, and that. But you look through that whole list and it's like, wow, boy, there's a heck of a lot of them out there. And if we try to describe everybody on each one of these, it's going to take a long time. And we'll show you how we've kind of condensed this down. Okay. In taking a look then at personality traits and that people are unique and are made up of multiple traits, Allport and Odbert, back in 1936, and trying to get a handle around this on how do we describe that uniqueness of each individual, found that in Webster's dictionary at that time, there are well over 18,000 words that could be used to represent personality traits. Now, that's a heck of a lot of words in a lexicon to describe somebody. Okay, what they wanted to do, though, is to say, can we cook that down? Are there some words that are very similar for the same thing? And, can we analyze this list in some way is to cook it down to a few, key factors. And what they developed was a procedure called factor analysis. It's a statistical procedure that is used to show how certain personality terms, like we looked at on the prior list, show similarity and a statistical similarity, how we can group them together and then give them a name. And let's take a look at an example here then. Okay, here's that list that we saw before, and we take a look at the list and you can look it through and you can start to see certain terms seem to be interrelated. Okay, as we go through, we have adventuresome, we have assertive, energetic, friendly, oftentimes go together. Gregarious goes together. Outgoing, personable. And you start to look at these and you start to say, well, gee, these things seem to go together in individuals and that. And let's say that we found a statistical relationship between these type terms. And now, the challenge is, what do I call that? What is a term that maybe includes all these different aspects? And it may come up with the notion of extroversion. And as we were talking about before, we said that, from the biological side, we find that extroverts, prefer to get out, get involved, do a lot of different things to produce greater stimulation that their brain normally doesn't have. So that adventuresome, that energetic, being assertive, gregarious, seeking out others, all those things, being outgoing, they're all going to come together to help us define an extrovert. So we analyze, we find out that those ones, kind of boxed in there in gold are statistically related. And then the challenge really of the trait theorist who's doing this analysis is then to come up with one term or a label to describe all those. And that's essentially what we do in factor analysis. Okay. From there, applying factor analysis, the Isings came up with what they called a two-polar dimensional scale that they thought that they could describe personality on. And they had extroversion, introversion, and then emotionally stable and emotionally unstable. And what they did is, in their factor analysis, they found that these traits up here towards the top generally represented more or less unstable characteristics of an individual. These traits down here below the midline, identified what we refer to as stable personalities. And then that they could be divided up either on the introvert side, these characterizing introversion, these characterizing extroversion. Okay, and obviously the preferable place would be is to be down here in these traits, whether you're introverted or extroverted. I think that's pretty much a time cost. Both are highly successful in life, but you would prefer to be more on the stable side than the unstable side. I'd certainly rather be identified as being calm as opposed to identified as being moody. We'd say it's really preferable, and probably most people that find themselves to be very moody or very touchy would rather be calm and more even-tempered, and so the stable side. But this is one of the approaches that Isaacs, Hans, and Sybil came up with. Okay. From there, we have a variety of other personality inventories, and an inventory basically is a test where there are generally true, false, or agree or disagree items. And one of the reasons we call it an inventory as opposed to a personality test is that generally inventories is a code word among psychologists, at least, and people that build these instruments, is that there really are no wrong or right answers, particularly individual answers on a test. Your assessment of your personality traits is how you answer a pattern of questions, such as maybe the characteristic extroversion. There may be anywhere from 8 to 20 questions on a test that are related to whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, and it's more the pattern of scoring you have. And no one single question, one way or the other, a yes or no, or agree or disagree, is going to throw you one way or the other way. It's kind of the composite of that scoring that occurs. Okay. One of the most famous personality inventories that we have is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, developed up at the University of Minnesota. And this particular instrument was well researched using individuals in a mental health hospital up there, and is used to basically identify clinical diagnoses for individuals. And so we use it to help us identify various emotional disorders that people have. And what they originally did is they went through and collected from the psychiatrists and psychologists working with the patients in the hospital a variety of behavioral statements that could be used to describe any type of mental disorder that people suffered from. Then they went through and had people categorize those traits or those behavioral statements into these represent schizophrenia, these represent depression, these represent that. And from there, then, they had developed, certain behavioral statements and went with certain disorders, put all those behavioral statements into a psychological test, which has better than 550 items on it. And based on your scoring across those 550, we come up with a psychological profile. So, it's an empirically based test. We've gone out, we've done a lot of research, and we have selected those questions that discriminate more or less between diagnostic groups. There were some behaviors that they came up with that we found that, oh gosh, this can go in 16 different categories, really doesn't discriminate between one category or another, and we removed those out and stayed with those that really had good discriminating value. Here's an example of a 16PF profile. You can see the variables that the test measures, 1 through 10, coming down. MMPI, I said 16PF. The MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic, there are 10 variables coming down the left column there. And we have hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, and you can read down through those. And what we're using it here basically is before treatment, is to go through and diagnose and see what's going on with the individual. And that's represented by the blue line. As you can see, when we get out here into the blue range, this represents what we call the clinically significant range, which means that, on average, these are higher scores than you would expect. And so this person here, this higher than average score would represent that they're suffering from depression. This score down here would tell us that there's some masculinity, femininity issues going on. And down here we see some anxiousness or guilt. What we don't see is concern for body symptoms. They don't think that they're always ill or getting sick or things like that. Psychologically, what we call somatoform disorder. Okay, and you can see some of the other variables that come down that we don't have to worry about here. and that, particularly social introversion. This person is not shy. This person probably, this score here would say they're leaning more towards probably being an extrovert as opposed to an introvert, and that. And so this is what we come through. But then we put them through therapy, and then we come back and, let's say, assess them 6 months, a year later, and then we look at the new profile we get, and we look to see if we have improvement. In this case here, we've got all the scores pulled back into what we refer to as the non-significant range, which means, pretty much the healthy range. And at this point, we would probably say that the treatment has worked with this individual. Look to if they have been in a mental health institution, to release them back into the population, or possibly if this is in a private practice, is to start talking about terminating therapy, maybe with a periodic follow-up to see how well they're doing. Okay. When we look at this today, then, today's, trait researchers, they look at these various dimensions, and we've gone over the years. We have the MMPI, which identifies 10. A fellow by the name of Cattell many years ago developed 16 factors, and then developed the 16 PF, or 16 personality profile test, and he came up with 16. And for a longest time, the 16 PF actually was our kind of our star test out there. And I was like, wow, we can take these 1,800 words and condense them down into 16 factors, and that worked well. Well, today psychologists believe, through using more modern methods of factor analysis and computers and statistical analysis, what we've been able to kind of come to an agreement is that we may be able to describe personality in as few as 5 factors, and that's what you see here on screen. We have conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion, and these are considered the big 5 personality factors today. And this was research that was done by a gentleman back in the 1990s to come up and develop this. Costa and McRae, as we can see down here, are 2 of those researchers, and they develop a psychological test called the NEO-PI, NEO-PI, NEO meaning new, PI meaning personality inventory. Today it's the NEO-PI-R, which means that it's been revised since its first test. But as we can see here, we come down these 5 major trait dimensions, and so we have conscientious up here, and we can see kind of endpoints. We have subscales under each one, and for a person who's very conscientious, we expect them to be organized, careful, and disciplined. And on the scale, we can go from organized to disorganized. And if people are scoring low over here, or scoring high on this side as opposed to this side, then we would say they're low in conscientiousness. But if they're scoring more towards organized, careful, and disciplined, then they're high in conscientiousness. And you can come down and you can look at the various variables here, or the 5 factors: agreeableness, soft-heartedness, more or less how do we get along with other people. Neuroticism gets into that emotional instability factor that the Isings were looking at, and where we have calm versus anxious, secure versus insecure, self-satisfied versus self-pitying. Another big 5 factor is openness to new experience, explore the world, try different things out. And so you can see imaginative, preference for variety, independent. These are things that generally characterize somebody who's open. And then down the extroversion, we have that sociable, fun-loving, affectionate, but more or less getting out, getting involved, trying new things. And so these are the big 5 variables. And today, the NEO-PI test, as well as some other tests, are out there that basically assess these big 5 variables. Okay. Some questions about the big 5. How stable are they? And what we see is that they're quite stable in adulthood. However, they can change over our development. Personality in our early years, as we start to form it and everything else, our personalities can change. And thank God, sometimes we start off on the wrong foot, but it means that we can correct it and change. But as we get older and we start moving into our later teens, and particularly into our early adulthood years, the personalities start to become much more stable and representative of the personality we're going to have throughout life, unless some major traumatic event occurs or, we go into psychotherapy. Okay. Are they inheritable? We believe that about 50% or so for each individual is actually inherited. So when you hear yourself sounding just like your dad or your mom, good reason, you've inherited part of that personality from them. How about are these personality variables are they common across different cultures? And what we find is, in particularly the big 5 factors, as we use them, yes, they are common across all cultures, and we could use this test in a variety of cultures then. Okay. Further evaluation of looking at the trait perspective is that one of the things is we say that personality is relatively persistent, and the research by Walter Mischel is very important here at looking at that, because what he found in his research, and you can see he's done 3 major studies on this, over several decades here, is that what he found is that personality traits can be situational, in a sense that overall you can be a relatively honest person, but there may be some situations in which that doesn't hold up. And how many times during tax season, maybe if you're older and filed a major tax return, do you find yourself sometimes looking at it and saying, this deduction, yeah, it's kind of in the gray area. I'm not sure if I should take it, but that's my money I paid in and I want it back, and you take it. Or maybe even where you take a deduction that you shouldn't take. I had a student years ago who used to talk about writing off his educational expenses, but under the circumstances in which he was in school, he shouldn't be. Yes, you can write them off, but he didn't have the proper circumstances. But heck, I'm paying for my education, I'm paying for these loans, I'm writing it off, and sure enough, he took it. I don't know if he ever got caught, but otherwise he was a very honest person. I had done some research with him and had known him for a number of years, and even after he graduated, and a very honest person. I would trust him, unquestionably. However, I don't know if I'd hire him to do my tax return. Okay, when we look at this, then this is where we start to look at that stability over time. And you come down here and you can see children are a little bit less stable. These are trait score correlations over 7 years. Children, we can see there's a lot more variability over 7 years. When we look at our college years, let's say 18 to 25, we start to become more stable. There's a better correlation there between early college years and later college years. When we look at 30-year-olds, and that, the personality we had at 30 towards at the end of 30 is even becoming much, much more stable, correlates much higher. And we get up to 50 to 70 years of age, and it becomes pretty much stable. When you're looking at people in that 50 to 70-year-old range, pretty much what you see is what you're going to get, and, either like it or, but it's not going to change. Type of thing. And so, with children, it can change. If you don't like it, children have the ability, here, a lot of flexibility to grow and change over time. But, let's face it, grandma and grandpa, what you see is what you're going to get, and that's going to be it pretty much to the end of their life. And you got to learn, figure out either live with it or you got to get out. Okay. A gentleman another researcher here that was important in this particular line of research is Samuel Gosling. And what he came up and said that traits are socially significant and that they influence health, thinking, and performance. So, even though maybe they're not as consistent as we like, traits do in fact predict behavior, and that they predict behavior that leads to a healthy lifestyle, and can be used to predict performance. In industrial organizational psychology, we do a lot of executive testing of executives, and when we use personality tests basically to predict whether they're going to be good performers or not. You go back to that big 5 theory that we just talked about, and when you zip back here and you take a look at some of these factors, we want people to be conscientious on the job, so you're looking for that. And do they need to be agreeable? Well, particularly if they're going to be a manager. Can they be neurotic? Well, people don't like working for people who are really wishy-washy and always changing, and particularly when they're kind of like powder kegs and be explosive. So you look for low neuroticism. Do you want them to be open? Well, you want your managers, in particular, to be open to new experiences and to listen to other ideas and not just go with the way they have. And extroversion, introversion, well, there is a somewhat of preference to look for extroversion, or the ability to be open and express. And that, to work for a boss that never talks to you, only emails you, it's probably not a good thing. So you look for them to be able to get out. And this is how we use psychological assessment in the workplace. So these factors are important in predicting performance in life. Okay, that wraps up this section on trait theory, and we'll come in and we'll talk about the last part, part 7, on looking at the social cognitive perspective.